If you're settling in for the night and looking for something gentle to drift off to, you're in the right place. Tonight, we're traveling back to a quieter America, to a time when the evenings were long, the skies were dark, and the horizon felt impossibly wide. In the small towns of 1800s Texas, people lived simple, steady lives, yet now and then, something unusual passed overhead. Soft lights. Drifting shapes. Quiet glimmers moving across the night sky, these weren't stories told with excitement or fear. They were whispered in calm voices on front porches and around campfires, spoken by folks who weren't trying to convince anyone of anything. Just sharing what they saw. And as you get comfortable, you and I will wander gently into those old evenings, listening to the slow rhythm of the past and letting our minds rest in the mystery that lingers there, so take a deep breath. Settle into whatever keeps you cozy. And let's begin our journey into one of the sleepiest, softest corners of American history. In the quiet stretch of the Texas frontier during the late 1800s, the nights carried a kind of stillness that is difficult to imagine today. Towns were small, roads were long, and the sky, more than anything, seemed impossibly large. People ended their days early, settling into sleep with lanterns dimmed and windows cracked open to let in the gentle breath of the warm evening air. And when the world grew silent, the sky became a companion, wide and patient, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch if one only reached far enough into the darkness. In that time, before electric lights began to wash the sky in a pale glow, the heavens stretched over Texas like an endless ocean of silver. The settlers who lived beneath it were no strangers to watching the stars. They watched them for weather, for guidance, and sometimes simply because the sky felt like a familiar friend. And it was under this sky, soft and deep and endlessly calm, that the earliest quiet whispers of strange sightings began to appear. Most people today imagine the Old West as a place of noise and restlessness, a landscape of constant motion and danger. But the truth is that many frontier communities lived slow, gentle lives shaped by routine and the natural rhythms of the land. Days were spent tending fields, repairing fences, and sharing simple meals with neighbors. Evenings settled in with the sound of crickets, the creaking of wooden porches, and the soft murmur of families gathered inside small warm rooms, preparing for another early morning. And yet, every so often, as the sun slid below the horizon and the first stars blinked awake, someone would glance upward and notice something that did not fit neatly into the ordinary patterns of the night. A drifting shape, or a moving glow, or a glimmer of something silent passing high above. These accounts were never told in frightened voices. They were spoken quietly, almost thoughtfully, as though the people describing them were not entirely sure what they had seen, or perhaps not entirely sure whether they had seen anything unusual at all. One such account came from a rancher near the Brazos River, a man known for his calm nature and practical view of the world. He was not someone given to tall tales or wild imagination. He spent his evenings watching over his land, stepping out to check on the livestock before settling in for the night. And it was during one of these quiet walks that he noticed something moving across the sky. He later explained it in a slow, uncertain way, as though working carefully through a memory that didn't quite settle into place. He said it was shaped like a long lantern, except far higher than any lantern could ever float, and it moved with a steady, gliding motion that reminded him of a boat drifting down a gentle river. He did not see wings. He did not hear sound. Just that soft, patient drifting glow crossing the night sky, like a traveler making its way across a silent world. He watched it until it vanished, not behind clouds, but as though it had simply dimmed into the distance. And once it was gone, he stood there for a moment, feeling the breeze on his face, wondering whether he should mention it to anyone at all. These early stories of strange lights and quiet moving shapes rarely grew into excitement or hope of discovery. They were spoken softly, sometimes shared with just one trusted neighbor. The frontier was a place where people respected the mysteries of nature. They knew that the land could surprise them. A sudden change in wind, a flash of weather on the horizon, an unexpected migration of birds. Strange things happened now and then, and not everything demanded an explanation. People lived close to the world around them, and learned to move with it rather than search for certainty in every shadow, but still. Every now and then, something appeared that lingered at the edges of memory longer than the usual wonders of the natural world. Something that caused a person to look upward with a different kind of curiosity, a softer kind of wonder. Children were often the first to notice. They would be outside finishing the last small tasks of the day, bringing in firewood or calling in animals, when they saw a light in the sky that didn't behave like the others. They described them with simple, innocent language. A moving star. A floating spark. A slow silver lamp. Parents listened, smiled, and gently encouraged them inside for bedtime. But the descriptions stayed in their minds, even if the adults said nothing. Old newspapers from the region occasionally printed small notes buried deep within their pages. Not bold headlines or urgent announcements, but small curiosity pieces, tucked between reports of weather and trade. A traveler's strange observation. A farmer's quiet letter mentioning an unusual light. A group of townspeople who shared a brief moment of uncertainty as they watched something drift overhead before continuing on their way. One such newspaper clipping mentioned a wandering light of unusual brightness seen above a rural community. The writer, clearly unsure what to make of it, described it as brighter than any known star, moving slower than a meteor, and appearing to carry a steady glow rather than the flicker of a passing fire. The article ended without conclusion, offering no explanation, only the gentle phrase, "It is likely a curiosity of nature, though worth noting for the record." And that was how most of these stories lived, quietly, without urgency, as though Texas itself had accepted that its skies held more than anyone truly understood. As the frontier continued to settle, families grew more comfortable with the land. They built larger homes, planted wider fields, and expanded their towns. But even as life changed, the night sky remained unchanged, watching over every new building, every new path carved through the dust, and always, now and then, someone would lift their gaze and see something drift by in that great expanse of darkness. Some described unusual shapes. Long and metallic, like a smooth hull of a ship without sails or rigging. Others mentioned rows of dim lights, arranged in a pattern they could not quite identify. A few saw soft silhouettes pass across the moon, so faint that one could almost believe they imagined it. But every account shared the same gentle tone, a quiet curiosity. A sense of peaceful wonder rather than fear. One story, told decades later by the granddaughter of an early settler, described a night when her grandfather and two neighbors stood outside after repairing a fence post. They were discussing the coming weather and the likelihood of rain when something caught their attention above the horizon. She said they stared at it for a long moment, none of them speaking. It moved slowly, almost lazily, as though carried along by an invisible wind. They watched it glide overhead, three grown men standing in the cool night air, quietly sharing a moment none of them could fully name. When it was gone, they nodded to one another, finished their work, and returned home. The story was passed down not as something remarkable or frightening, but as something beautiful, a memory of men pausing to watch the sky together, touched by a mystery that belonged to no one and harmed nothing, and so these early accounts created a kind of soft foundation for what would come years later. They weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to be sensational. They were simply part of life on the quiet Texas frontier, moments of wonder woven gently into the fabric of ordinary days. It is easy now, looking back, to label these sightings as something specific. To call them airships, or early UFOs, or misunderstandings of natural light. But to the people who lived through them, these moments were less about definition and more about the simple experience of seeing something unusual in the sky. Something that encouraged them, if only for a moment, to look up and imagine possibilities beyond their daily routines. And even though they rarely spoke openly about these things, the memories stayed with them, soft, subtle, drifting like the lights themselves across the stillness of the night. In the quiet of those evenings, when the warm air settled gently over the land and the stars shimmered high above, people felt a closeness to the sky that most of us have lost. Watching it was almost meditative. A slow, calming ritual that brought peace after long days filled with hard work. The sky was a space where thoughts softened, where worries loosened their grip, and where the mysteries of the world felt less like puzzles and more like quiet companions, and perhaps that is why these early sightings continue to draw curiosity today. They belong to a time of slow living, when people were deeply connected to the land and the sky, and when mysteries carried a softer, more contemplative tone. These sightings invite us to imagine what it might have been like to stand on a quiet Texas plain, feeling the gentle brush of night air, and witnessing something glide silently across the heavens. As you let this part of the story settle in your mind, allow yourself to picture that vast sky. Open and serene, stretching across the quiet frontier. Imagine the gentle rhythm of those nights, the simple routines of early settlers, and the soft glow of something unknown drifting calmly above them. In the years that followed those earliest quiet sightings across the Texas frontier, the stories began to drift farther from campfires and family porches and found their way into letters, slowly, gently, almost unintentionally. People of the late 1800s wrote letters with great care, not only to share news but to steady their thoughts. And because the frontier could feel isolated at times, letters traveled like small threads woven between families, binding distant places with familiar handwriting. Among the usual messages, updates about crops, the health of relatives, a new baby born or a barn needing repairs, there were occasional lines that mentioned something else. A strange light over the field. A glimmering shape in the sky during an evening walk. A moment of quiet wonder witnessed alone. These notes were never sensational. They didn't claim anything extraordinary. They simply described what was seen, set gently into the middle of a paragraph about everyday life, as though the writer was unsure how much importance to give it. One letter written by a schoolteacher from a tiny settlement near Waco described an evening when she had stayed late in her small one-room schoolhouse, finishing her lessons by lamplight. She wrote about the warmth of the day, the dusty boards beneath her feet, the sound of the creek outside flowing slowly under the summer heat. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned glancing outside as she closed the shutters and seeing a long shape, softly glowing, pass over the distant treetops. It moved slowly, she said, so slowly she first mistook it for a lantern carried high on a pole. But the more she watched, the more she realized it was far above anything a person could carry. And as it traveled across the sky, she felt no alarm, only a gentle sense of wonder, as though she were witnessing something that didn't expect to be understood. She wrote this in her letter with such calm curiosity, almost like someone describing the color of a flower or the path of a cloud. Her words carried no urgency, no desire to prove anything. She was simply sharing a moment of quiet observation. As though she believed the receiver would appreciate the strangeness without needing an explanation, another letter came from a traveling salesman who spent most of his weeks riding between small towns, carrying tools, buckles, tins, and fabric tucked neatly inside a weather-worn wagon. Life on the road gave him long hours alone under open skies, and he often wrote to his family about the changing landscapes he passed through. In one letter dated around the mid-1880s, he described stopping beside a broad pasture at dusk to rest his horse and eat a small supper. As he sat there, the last reddish light fading from the horizon, he noticed something far above him. He didn't rush to describe it. Instead, he wrote first about the quiet of the moment, about the warm smell of the grass, and the soft crunch of the bread he ate while the horse lowered its head to graze. Only then did he mention a silver glimmer high above, shaped more like a long beam of polished wood than anything natural. It drifted with a steady, balanced motion, almost like a gentle pendulum swinging through the sky. He watched it travel from one end of the horizon to the other, and he wrote that he felt a strange comfort in its presence, as though it were some faraway traveler crossing the night just as he was crossing the land. He didn't claim to understand what he saw, nor did he try to name it. He simply described the movement, the light, and the way it made him feel calm, reflective, and strangely connected to the world around him. His letter ended by saying he would remember that quiet moment on the open field for many years, long after the roads had changed and the towns had grown. These letters, scattered across different places and written by different hands, carried a shared tone, soft, thoughtful, and free of the noise that often surrounds such stories today. There was no rush to draw conclusions. No pressure to solve a puzzle. The writers seemed content to describe, not interpret. And in that simplicity, their words gained a kind of gentle authenticity, as though the mystery itself was meant to remain quiet. Occasionally, townspeople shared these letters with local newspapers, and a few were printed as small curiosities, tucked between updates on regional fairs and weather predictions. One paper from the late 1800s included a reprinted letter from a man who had been riding home late from a neighboring town. He described seeing a dark outline pass across the moon, large enough that it momentarily softened the moonlight around it. The shape, he wrote, was smooth and curved, almost like the hull of a ship turned upside down. It moved without sound, gliding calmly across the sky before fading into the night. The editor who included the letter did not offer any explanation. Instead, he left a simple remark at the end: "These lands hold many wonders. And our skies are no less mysterious." Throughout Texas, these small written accounts created a quiet sense of shared experience. People who had never met one another had seen similar movements in the sky, similar drifting lights, similar soft glows that came and went without disturbance. Over time, these accounts became known as the airship letters, not because they confirmed anything, but because the shapes and motions described reminded readers of ships, long, curved, steady, and built for travel. The word airship felt comforting, familiar, and rooted in the world of handcrafted wood and iron that people understood. It allowed them to imagine the unknown without fear, to place the strange gently within their own framework of the world. These letters passed slowly from hand to hand, folded neatly, held carefully, and stored in quiet drawers. They became small pieces of family history, moments captured in ink, preserved not for their mystery but for their beauty. And whenever someone read them aloud, there was always a pause afterward, a moment of soft reflection when the listener would look out a nearby window, imagining the sky not as it was now, but as it must have looked over a century ago, untouched by city lights, calm and infinite. In the stillness of these stories, there is something deeply human. People of that era lived close to the land, and when they wrote with intention. Letters were more than communication, they were expressions of presence, of connection, of the thoughts that linger after the day's labor is done. And the fact that so many letters quietly mention strange lights or drifting shapes reveals something tender about the way frontier people saw their world. They did not push away the unexplainable. They did not try to bend it into certainty. They simply acknowledged it as another piece of the vast and beautiful night that covered them. Even today, reading these old accounts can create a sense of closeness to those who lived long before us. You can almost feel the warm air of their summer nights, smell the dust of the open fields, and hear the soft echo of insects along the grass. You can imagine them standing in worn boots beside a fence, or sitting in the doorway of a small schoolhouse, or resting at the edge of a campfire. And looking up, always looking up, the long glow drifting overhead might have lasted only a moment. The memory, though, stayed much longer. It settled into their thoughts like a gentle secret, something to be remembered on future nights when the sky felt especially bright or especially quiet, and as more letters appeared, the sense of shared wonder deepened. People began to realize that these gentle sightings were not isolated moments but part of a wider pattern that stretched across counties and years. The same drifting motion. The same soft glow. The same silence, yet still, no answers, only stories. Only memories, only that quiet, unbroken connection to the sky. As you let these moments settle in your mind, imagine each letter as a small lantern of its own, carrying the thoughts of someone long gone, traveling gently across time the way those drifting lights once traveled across the Texas sky. Imagine the softness of the paper, the uneven strokes of ink, the breath of the person who wrote it. And imagine the night that inspired their words, the kind of night that slows the world down, that makes everything feel closer, quieter, easier to hold. There is more to uncover as the story continues, more sightings and more curious accounts waiting gently in the years ahead. For now, allow yourself to rest in the quiet rhythm of these early letters, the gentle beginnings of a mystery that would echo softly through Texas history. As the 1890s approached, Texas was changing in quiet but noticeable ways. More rail lines were spreading across the state, connecting distant towns with long, winding tracks that hummed gently under the weight of passing trains. Newspapers grew thicker, carrying not only local notices but stories from far-off cities. And as communities became more connected, the subtle murmur of strange sightings, those drifting lights and gentle shapes in the sky, began to travel farther too. The stories did not arrive all at once. They moved slowly, like small ripples passing over a calm pond. A letter published in a newspaper in one county would be clipped out and sent to a cousin in another. A traveler stopping at a general store would mention, with a soft laugh, something curious he'd seen while riding at dusk. And sometimes a small crowd of neighbors would stand outside after a meeting, their voices low, sharing memories of things they couldn't quite explain. These moments were never rushed. People spoke in the gentle, thoughtful way that comes naturally when the night is deep and the world is quiet. And as they talked, they often found that someone else, someone standing just a few steps away, had seen something similar. One of the accounts that spread quietly through central Texas came from a group of railroad workers maintaining a stretch of track outside a small settlement. They spent long hours outside, often beginning before sunrise and finishing after sunset, adjusting bolts, checking ties, and watching for signs of wear along the rails. One cool evening, as the sky deepened into a soft shade of blue, the men sat together near the tracks, eating their supper from tin plates. They were tired, their voices low and easy. Someone was telling a story about a stubborn mule he once owned, when one of the men paused mid-sentence. He looked upward, squinting slightly, as though trying to focus on something far away. The others followed his gaze, and for a long moment, the group sat there in silence. High above them, gliding smoothly across the darkening sky, was a shape unlike anything they had seen before. It was long and narrow, almost like the hull of a riverboat turned sideways. Though the light was faint, they could make out a soft glow outlining its edges, nothing bright or sharp, just a gentle illumination, similar to the glow of a lantern through fog. The men watched it drift steadily overhead, moving with a calmness that made the moment feel strangely peaceful. There was no sound except the distant hum of insects, and for a few seconds, the world seemed to pause around them. Later, when they spoke of it, no one tried to argue or claim they had seen something more dramatic than what it was. They simply described the slow movement, the quiet glow, and the way the object seemed to float with purpose, as though traveling a path known only to itself. And once they had shared their thoughts, they returned to their supper, the story becoming just another gentle memory woven into the rhythm of their long days. Around that same time, stories began to reach Texas from travelers who had crossed the borders from neighboring states. A man from Arkansas described seeing a similar drifting shape while walking along a quiet road at night. A woman from Oklahoma wrote to her aunt in Texas about a silent lantern in the sky that moved with a mind of its own. These accounts were not the loud declarations often associated with strange sightings today. They were soft, personal reflections, shared with the same calm tone one might use to describe a dream or a distant memory. In many ways, the land itself encouraged this kind of quiet storytelling. The Texas landscape in the late 1800s was vast and open, filled with long stretches of plains and rolling hills, broken only by clusters of trees or the distant outline of a town. On clear nights, the sky felt close, almost intimate, as though pressing gently around the people who lived beneath it. It was a sky that welcomed long thoughts and slow breaths, a sky that brought comfort even when it held mysteries. One of the most touching accounts from this era came from an elderly couple who lived near the edge of a prairie. They had built their small wooden house by hand, piece by piece, over many years. They spent most evenings on their porch, sharing stories while watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the world in quiet shades of gold and fading blue. On one such evening, as they sat together wrapped in a shared blanket, the wife noticed a long streak of pale light drifting above the far treetops. She nudged her husband gently, and the two of them watched in silence as the glow traveled slowly across the sky. She later described it as graceful, almost delicate, like a ribbon of soft silver moving through the dark. Her husband, who had spent a lifetime working the land and observing its quiet changes, said it reminded him of a ship sailing through a calm harbor, steady, smooth, and unhurried. They watched until it disappeared into the distance, and when it was gone, they simply sat for a while longer, leaning into one another, letting the stillness of the moment settle around them. They did not worry about what it was or where it came from. They simply treasured the experience, folding it into their long life together like another shared memory. As more of these gentle accounts spread across Texas, a quiet shift began to take place in the way people talked about the sky. They no longer saw the sightings as isolated curiosities. Instead, they began to feel like part of a larger pattern, something slow-moving, peaceful, and strangely familiar. A kind of presence that drifted above them, appearing now and then but never disturbing the world below. This sense of pattern became especially noticeable when small groups of people started witnessing the same thing at the same time. One evening, in a modest town surrounded by fields of cotton, a handful of residents gathered near the local church after a community meeting. The night was warm and gentle, with the scent of wildflowers hanging softly in the air. As they chatted in small clusters, someone pointed toward the sky, and conversations gradually faded. Above them, gliding in a quiet arc, was a long, pale shape illuminated by a soft, steady glow. It moved slowly, almost thoughtfully, as though taking its time crossing the world. No one panicked. No one shouted. The townspeople simply watched with the kind of quiet awe usually reserved for shooting stars or sunsets. When the shape disappeared behind a bank of thin clouds, people looked at one another with gentle expressions, as though they had shared something rare and unexpectedly beautiful. And then, slowly, they returned to their conversations, speaking in softer voices now, carrying the moment with them like a small, delicate treasure. These shared sightings deepened the sense of calm mystery surrounding the phenomenon. They reminded people that the world was larger than they could fully understand. And that sometimes the sky held wonders that asked nothing of them except quiet attention. Even the newspapers, which often took a practical tone, wrote about these moments with a sense of gentle curiosity. Articles described the sightings as unusual movements in the night sky or curious aerial glows, avoiding speculation and instead focusing on the simple details reported by witnesses. The papers seemed to understand that these stories were not meant to be sensational. They were meant to be observed, appreciated, and passed along with care. By the late 1890s, the quiet talk of drifting lights and gentle shapes had become a familiar part of frontier storytelling. Families spoke of them with the same tone used to describe distant storms or the rare passing of a comet. Not something to fear, just something to notice. Something to remember, and although many people wondered what these shapes could be, airships, perhaps, or some unknown natural phenomenon, the speculation never overshadowed the softness of the stories. The mystery remained gentle, like a quiet question whispered into the night and left unanswered, not because the answer didn't exist, but because the question itself brought a kind of peace. As you let this part of the story settle, imagine those Texas nights again, the vast open land, the warm breeze carrying the scent of dust and grass, the soft glow of lanterns behind windows, and above it all, the wide, calm sky. Imagine standing there among those early settlers, feeling the stillness around you, and looking up to see that faint drifting shape traveling peacefully across the heavens. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that comes after a long stretch of uncertainty. In the small Texas town scattered across the wide and open landscape, people returned to their routines, but they carried with them a sense of quiet watchfulness. It was not fear, and it was not excitement. It was something softer, like the way a person listens more closely after hearing a sound they cannot explain. Travelers moving between towns spoke in low voices about the drifting lights that had been seen in the sky, moving in ways that did not match any lantern or star. Some claimed the lights changed color slowly, like a living ember cooling and brightening again. Others said that the lights seemed to follow the horizon, as if traveling alongside those who watched them. These descriptions always came out gentle and unhurried, told by people who were not trying to convince anyone of anything. They were simply recalling what they remembered, unsure what to make of it, offering the story like a small object set on a table for others to examine. The fields were settling into their winter quiet, and as the days grew shorter, the long evenings seemed to stretch farther than usual. Many families found themselves sitting outside at dusk, watching the sky the way people today might watch a television screen. There was comfort in the soft glow of the early night, in the steady rhythm of crickets, in the faint rustle of dry grass shifting lightly as the wind moved through it. The sky felt larger in those evenings, almost as though it leaned a little closer to the world below. It was during one of those evenings that a rancher named Elijah saw something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He was sitting on the edge of his porch, his boots resting on the step below, a cup of warm coffee held loosely in both hands. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the deep, fading orange that slowly melts into the soft blue of twilight. He was thinking about repairs that needed doing before the colder months, letting his mind wander gently, when a strange movement caught his attention. High above the field, a faint shape drifted across the sky. It moved slowly, not with the steadiness of a cloud or the flicker of a shooting star, but with a deliberate, quiet path. It was only a dim outline at first, a pale glow, almost as if moonlight had gathered into a loose form. Elijah watched without standing or calling for anyone. He simply let his eyes follow it. As the shape glided farther, it seemed to shift its brightness, becoming a little more defined as it approached the edge of his property. It never flashed or pulsed. Instead, it glowed with the soft steadiness of a lantern hidden behind a thin piece of cloth. Elijah later said that the shape did not frighten him. It felt more like watching a distant wagon moving along a ridge at night. Something far away and of no harm. It passed overhead without a sound and continued slowly eastward. After a few moments, the glow softened until it faded into the sky, leaving nothing behind but calm darkness. He took a long breath and finished his coffee. When he stood to go back inside, he felt strangely peaceful, as if he had witnessed something gentle rather than unknown. He did not tell anyone that night. He kept the moment for himself, letting it settle in his mind like a quiet memory from a dream. In the days that followed, others reported similar sights. The descriptions were always unhurried, always spoken with the same soft tone. People noticed how the lights moved without urgency. How they appeared and disappeared with no disruption to the world around them. There was something soothing about these sightings, something that encouraged reflection more than worry. Some wondered if these drifting shapes were simply a rare kind of weather phenomenon, perhaps reflections of light or unusual air patterns that were not yet understood. Others believed they were something else entirely, something that had watched the growing towns of Texas long before fences and roads began to shape the land. Whatever the explanation, the stories continued to spread slowly from one porch to another, passed along in the calm manner of people who had no reason to embellish what they had seen. As winter approached, the nights grew even longer. The cool air carried scents of dry cedar and distant wood smoke. Families sat together under blankets, telling stories under the open sky. And although the drifting lights were not seen every night, the possibility of them settled into the minds of many. The sky felt a little more alive, a little more aware, as though the world above and the world below were sharing quiet glances. These quiet evenings, filled with soft observations and gentle wonder, became part of the fabric of life in the region. People continued their days as usual, tending to their tasks and responsibilities, but there was a subtle shift in the way they looked upward. The sky, once a simple backdrop, now held a calm promise of something beyond their understanding, something that chose to remain peaceful and distant. And so, as the year came to a close, the stories became part of local memory. They were not passed down as warnings or as grand tales meant to amaze. They were spoken softly, much like a bedtime story, reminding listeners of the quiet nights when Texas felt especially wide, and the sky seemed just a little bit closer. The gentle mystery of the drifting lights settled into the hearts of those who had seen them, leaving them with a calm curiosity that lingered long after the lights themselves had faded from view. In the weeks that followed, the mystery of the drifting lights settled into an even softer rhythm. Life across the Texas countryside continued at its usual pace, but there was a growing sense that the quiet land held more stories than anyone had ever expected. The field stretched wide beneath the winter sky, and the days felt slower, as though time itself was moving carefully so it would not disturb whatever lingered in the stillness. Travelers passing through the region noticed how often people looked upward now. Not with fear, but with gentle curiosity, like someone watching the surface of a calm pond, waiting to see if a single ripple might appear. The open sky had always been a companion to those who lived on the frontier. But now it felt a little more companionable, almost as if it was listening. One evening, a schoolteacher named Clara found herself walking home later than usual. Her small classroom sat on the edge of town, not much more than a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof and a narrow porch out front. She often stayed behind to tidy the desks or to prepare lessons for the next day, but this evening had lasted longer than expected. By the time she stepped outside, night had already gathered gently around the town. The air was cool, and a faint dryness carried the smell of dust and distant fireplaces. Clara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and began the walk home along a worn dirt road that curved between low fields. The silence around her felt comforting, as if the world had gone quiet to give her space to think. She took her time, matching her steps to the soft rhythm of her thoughts. Halfway home, she noticed a faint glow appearing over the fields to her left. It was small at first, no brighter than a lantern seen from far away. She slowed, her breath steady, her steps gentle. The glow rose slightly, then drifted sideways, almost weightless against the night sky. Clara stopped walking, letting the moment unfold without the need to explain it. The glowing shape took on a steady brightness, soft and milky, like moonlight filtered through thin cloth. It moved with such calm ease that Clara felt no tension in her chest, only a quiet sense of awe. The light traveled slowly, almost as if it were wandering rather than traveling. For a moment, it seemed to hover, then it continued its gentle path toward the horizon. Clara stood in the stillness, holding her shawl close, watching until the shape diminished into a faint shimmer and then into nothing at all. When it was gone, she breathed out softly, surprised at how peaceful she felt. There was no urge to run home or tell anyone immediately. The experience felt personal, almost private. Like being entrusted with something quiet and fragile. Later, she would try to describe it in her journal, writing in careful handwriting by the flickering light of a small oil lamp. She wrote about the movement, the brightness, the gentle nature of the moment. She didn't call it strange or unsettling. Instead, she described it as something graceful and unhurried, something that belonged to the night as naturally as the stars themselves. In town, a few others reported similar sights around the same time. A group of ranch hands returning from a long day's work said they watched a pale glow drift above the far hills for several minutes before fading away. A traveling preacher mentioned seeing what looked like a softly lit ribbon stretching across the sky before it dissolved into thin air. None of these accounts were grand or alarming. They were simply observations, quietly given, like a neighbor offering a cup of warm tea. As the stories began to weave together, people felt a gentle reassurance rather than a growing fear. The light seemed patient and unthreatening, appearing only briefly and never disturbing the ground below. Even those who had never witnessed the lights found themselves thinking about them in calm moments, imagining what they might have looked like, wondering if they would ever see one themselves. The winter continued to settle over Texas, laying a hush over the land. Evenings grew longer, and families spent more time indoors around warm fires, telling stories to pass the time. And always, somewhere in the background of conversation, rested the thought of the drifting lights. They became part of the season, like a quiet visitor who touched the nights without ever making demands. Clara began to walk home slower each evening, taking time to gaze at the open sky. She knew she might never see the strange glow again, but she found comfort in the possibility. There was something beautiful about not knowing, something soothing in the mystery that lingered just beyond understanding. It reminded her that the world was wider than the maps and books could show, and that even in the quietest places, something gentle and unknown might be passing overhead. As the nights went on, the stories became woven into the calm fabric of daily life. They did not aim to astonish or frighten. Instead, they encouraged a slower gaze, a stillness of mind, an awareness of beauty that did not need explanation. The people of Texas carried the mystery of the drifting lights quietly, like a lantern kept dim to preserve the softness of the night. As winter deepened, the rhythm of daily life settled into something even quieter than before. The Texas countryside, already wide and open, felt like it had expanded a little farther, giving every town and homestead a cushion of stillness. People moved through their days with the soft patience that comes when the nights grow longer and tasks slow down with the cold. And through all of this, the memory of the drifting lights remained, gentle and persistent, resting in the back of people's minds like a half-remembered song. In a small settlement near the railroad line, a carpenter named Thomas began noticing how often the townsfolk paused their conversations to glance at the sky. Even those who had never seen the lights themselves behaved as though the sky held a quiet importance, as if it had become part of the community. The railroad men arriving from farther west brought news of similar stories from dusty outposts along the tracks. They too spoke of faint glows and drifting shapes that moved without sound, appearing on calm nights and fading as easily as a sigh. Thomas listened to these travelers as he repaired their tools or tightened the boards on their wagons. He liked how simply they told their stories. No one tried to shape the events into something grand. They spoke softly, sometimes with the weariness of long travel, sometimes with a small, thoughtful smile as they remembered the way a light had moved gently across the sky. It made Thomas feel as though he was gathering small pieces of something larger, something patient, something not meant to startle but to be noticed only by those willing to be still. One evening, after closing his workshop, he walked to the edge of town where a narrow bridge crossed a shallow creek. He often went there when he needed a quiet moment, letting the cool air settle around him as he listened to the faint trickle of water below. The sky above was unusually clear, with the stars shining like pinpricks of silver scattered across deep indigo. Thomas rested his hands on the wooden rail of the bridge and looked upward, not expecting anything, simply enjoying the stillness. After a long while, a soft glow appeared near the northern horizon. It rose slowly, so gently that Thomas didn't notice at first. When he finally did, he simply watched with calm curiosity. The glow was pale at the edges, slightly brighter at its center, moving with the same unhurried grace that had been described in so many quiet stories. It drifted along a steady path. Not straight but not wandering either, almost like a slow float carried by a breeze too gentle to feel. Thomas followed its movement with his eyes, letting the sight wash over him. The glow shifted softly, almost imperceptibly, as though adjusting itself to the shape of the sky. He felt no sense of urgency or wonder that demanded explanation. Instead, he felt a calm awareness, the kind that settles deep within a person when they witness something peaceful and rare. He thought about the stories he had heard, the hushed voices in his workshop, the gentle descriptions of light that seemed to belong to the quietest nights. The glow continued across the sky, crossing above the creek, lighting the surface just enough to reveal the thin ripples moving beneath the bridge. Thomas watched until it reached the far side of the horizon and dissolved into the night. When it was gone, he took a long breath and let it out slowly, feeling a sense of ease settle into his shoulders. He walked home with a steady pace, carrying the moment with him like a small warmth. When he reached his house, he didn't feel the need to write it down or talk about it immediately. The experience felt complete on its own, a peaceful memory he could return to whenever the days felt too heavy. It became part of him, tucked away like a quiet reminder that the world held gentle mysteries waiting patiently in the night sky. Over time, people across the region developed a kind of unspoken understanding. The drifting lights were no longer strange events to be questioned, but subtle visitors that passed through the evenings. They were not expected, yet no one was surprised when they appeared. They became part of the landscape in the way a distant train whistle or the soft glow of campfires might become part of a place. Families sitting together after supper would sometimes fall silent at the same moment, eyes drifting upward in the shared hope of catching a glimpse. Some nights the sky remained still, offering only stars and the faint glow of the moon. Other nights held a gentle shimmer, a faint shape drifting across the darkness. People described these moments not as sightings but as encounters, soft and fleeting, as though the sky was brushing its sleeve lightly against their world. And as the season slowly shifted again, the stories remained, woven into the quiet evenings and peaceful mornings. The drifting lights became a thread in the fabric of their days, calming in their presence and comforting in their mystery. The land felt wider, the nights felt deeper, and the people carried a quiet sense that something gentle passed above them from time to time, expecting nothing, offering only a moment of wonder to those who happened to look upward at just the right time. As the months drifted quietly into the following year, the stories of the drifting lights became a familiar thread woven through life on the Texas frontier. They were spoken of not as strange events, nor as warnings, but as gentle memories that rested comfortably in the minds of those who lived beneath the wide and patient sky. The land, with its long stretches of prairie and its slow, unhurried winds, seemed the perfect place for such mysteries to settle. In the early spring, when the air began to warm and the grasses brushed softly against the breeze, a sense of renewal touched the small towns. New fences were built, roads were mended, and wagons traveled again with a little more purpose after the stillness of winter. Yet even with the changing season, people held on to the quiet habit they had formed, taking moments to look toward the sky, letting their eyes linger on the soft colors of dusk. One evening, a traveling herbalist named May, who had been moving from settlement to settlement, paused her journey to rest near a grove of mesquite trees. She had heard the stories of the lights during her travels and had listened to each one with a peaceful curiosity. She never dismissed the accounts, nor did she try to explain them. Instead, she carried them with her the way one carries a gentle tune, recalling them when the road grew long and the nights felt especially wide. As the sun dipped low, May sat beside her small campfire, enjoying the warmth as the sky faded from gold to a deepening blue. The evening was quiet except for the soft crackle of burning wood and an occasional rustle in the grass. She leaned back, resting her hands on the cool earth, feeling the calm of the moment settle around her. It was then, just above the tree line, that she noticed a faint glow rising slowly into view. It appeared with the same gentle certainty described by the many voices she had met along her travels. The glow drifted with a quiet grace, neither bright nor dim, but holding a soft, steady presence. May watched with a relaxed stillness, her breathing even, her thoughts unhurried. The drifting light floated across the sky in a slow arc, passing above the grove, gliding as peacefully as a feather carried by a mild breeze. There was no sound, no sudden movement, nothing to startle or disturb the moment. May felt a deep, comforting calm as she followed its path. It felt almost familiar, as though she had seen it before in the stories she held close. The light continued its gentle passage, eventually softening at the edges until it blended into the sky. May remained seated for a long while after it faded, wrapped in the quiet sense of being part of something serene and unspoken. When she finally lay down beneath the stars, she closed her eyes with the knowing that mysteries did not always need answers. Some were meant to be witnessed, felt, and set gently into memory. Across Texas, people carried similar moments, quiet sightings, half-remembered glows, and peaceful encounters with the night sky. The drifting lights never caused harm, never stirred panic. They came and went with the same calm presence as a passing cloud or a gentle breath of wind. The stories passed from town to town were never told with urgency, but with fond reflection, as one might share a soft recollection from childhood. Even those who had never seen the lights found comfort in the idea of them. The world of the frontier could be harsh at times, but the notion of a gentle mystery moving peacefully overhead gave people something soothing to hold on to. It reminded them that the sky, with all its depth and quiet expanse, carried wonders that asked nothing of them but a moment of stillness. Over time, the lights stopped appearing as frequently. Some said they had moved on, drifting to new horizons beyond the settlements. Others believed they still passed overhead on quiet nights, simply unnoticed by those who no longer looked upward as often. But the memory remained, soft, warm, and unbroken, and so, as the years eased forward, the drifting lights of the 1800s became one of those peaceful corners of history. Not a legend meant to thrill, but a gentle recollection meant to soothe. A part of Texas's long story, lingering like a quiet echo from the past. Reminding listeners that some mysteries arrive softly, leave quietly, and remain only in the hearts of those who pause long enough to watch the night. For anyone who hears these stories today, they carry the same quiet invitation, to slow down, breathe a little deeper, and imagine the calm glow drifting across a vast Texas sky long ago. A reminder that the world holds gentle wonders, both then and now, waiting patiently for anyone willing to lift their gaze and linger in the stillness. Our journey through the quiet corners of history has come to a gentle close for tonight. The stories of long-ago skies, drifting lights, and whispered moments among the towns and fields of Texas now rest softly in your mind, like embers fading in a slow, comforting glow. The past, with all its mysteries and quiet wonders, lingers gently around us, waiting patiently for another evening when we might return to wander its peaceful landscapes. Let your thoughts drift along the same paths, through endless fields, beneath wide, starlit skies, where time feels slower and the world a little softer. As the night settles fully around you, take a deep breath, feel the calm of centuries past, and let your imagination float with the gentle rhythm of history. Good night. And rest well, time traveler.